There are stories that inspire us, unite us, that bring out the best in all of us. Everyday men and women in extraordinary situations. Americans who become heroes. Americans who become legends. Join us as we share the story of American valor from World War II to the present day, as we meet the heroes among us.
Within the United States military, there exists no more sacred recognition than the Medal of Honor. Our nation's highest military honor, it is awarded by the President in the name of Congress for personal acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. 895 men have been awarded the Medal of Honor for valor during and since World War II. Today, only a fraction survive. When you speak to a recipient of the Medal of Honor, you will always hear the same sentiment. The medal is not about them. It is about those who served with them, those who sacrificed with them, and in many cases, those who died alongside them. The men who wear the Medal of Honor are not just flesh and blood. They're a symbol of the valor and sacrifice of entire generations. As we celebrate their individual stories, we honor the stories of so many more. We honor countless unheralded Americans who played their part in something much larger than themselves.
Before sunrise, July 13th, 2008, northern Afghanistan. A small band of U.S. Army paratroopers take their positions around their vehicle patrol base, VPB Kaler, near the Afghan village of Wanat. These men of chosen company were less than 2 weeks from the end of their 14-month deployment. On a ridge near the main base was a small observation post, dubbed OP Topside, manned by 9 paratroopers. As the early light began to peek over the mountains, the men at Kaler noticed suspicious activity in the high ground just west of the village. Before the soldiers at Topside could complete a request for warning fire to scare off the likely insurgents, a machine gun burst rang out from a building to the north. At that, the entire valley erupted in fire from multiple directions. It was 4:20 a.m. The paratroopers immediately realized they were under a full-scale assault from more than 200 insurgents, who were now raining fire on 48 Americans. The massive first volley had devastated Topside, killing 2 and wounding the remainder. The bloodied survivors needed to rally fast or be overrun. Among the survivors at Topside was a 22-year-old sergeant, Ryan Pitts. His legs had been peppered by grenade shrapnel and his left arm wounded. Bleeding heavily, he only survived thanks to the quick action of his brother-in-arms, Corporal Jason Bogar, who applied a tourniquet to his leg. Motivated by the spirit of his fellow paratroopers, Sergeant Pitts crawled to the north end of Topside and began tossing grenades at the enemy. His tactic of cooking off the grenades, letting the fuse burn for several seconds before throwing them, put himself at great danger, but prevented the insurgents from throwing the grenades back at the wounded soldiers before they detonated. The paratroopers at Topside returned fire and slowed the enemy's assault, which allowed Pitts to call in a situation report to his company commander. In an effort to conserve grenades, though unable to stand, he forced himself to his knees and manned Topside's machine gun, firing directly into the enemy's position. Minutes later, Lieutenant John Brostrom and Corporal Jason Hovader braved direct fire to race from the main base to Topside to reinforce its desperate defense. They relieved the badly wounded Sergeant Pitts, who then continued to man the radio and call in fire support. Suddenly, all outgoing fire from within Topside went silent, and the enemy's guns and shouts were the only sounds Pitts could hear. The reinforcing soldiers had all been killed. The survivors, in need of ammunition and medical aid, and believing everyone at Topside was dead, retreated back to the main patrol base. Alone and weakened from the blood loss, Sergeant Pitts radioed his commander, only to learn that no reinforcements could be spared. The insurgent attackers were now so close to Pitts that he resigned himself to the fact that he would not make it out alive. Determined to go down fighting, Sergeant Pitts grabbed a nearby grenade launcher and called on the radio for any soldier with a view of topside to begin firing over the sandbag wall that separated him from the enemy. Fellow paratrooper Brian Hassong heard the call and provided the suppressing fire. In the midst of the fighting, Sean Samaro, Israel Garcia, Mike Denton, and Jacob Soanes braved the fire to make their way to topside, finding the badly wounded Pitts fighting for his life. Just as they began to treat Pitts and take defensive positions, another blast rocked topside, mortally wounding 24-year-old Sergeant Israel Garcia, who gave his life to save Pitts. Also killed in the battle was 25-year-old Corporal Jason Bogar, whose quick actions at the outset had saved Pitts and allowed him to fight on. Minutes later, attack helicopters arrived to provide close air support, and at 6:15 a.m., after fighting for well over an hour while badly wounded, Sergeant Pitts was medically evacuated from the battlefield. His solitary stand bought U.S. forces precious time in reinforcing the post and calling in air support, actions that directly helped turn the tide of the battle. The actions of Ryan Pitts were just one of many examples of American valor that day. The Army's report on the battle concluded that the individual exploits of bravery are too numerous to document. Yet on July 21st, 2014, he became only the 12th recipient of the Medal of Honor for valor in Afghanistan. Valor was everywhere that day, Ryan Pitts said upon receiving the medal. Indeed, it was. Among the 48 soldiers who stood against overwhelming odds and the 9 young Americans who lost their lives in the battle, he accepted the Medal of Honor for them, vowing to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. In honor of the sacrifice of the fallen heroes of the Battle of Wanat, may we all strive to live such a life.
My fallen comrades' names were Sergio Abad, Jonathan Ayers, Jason Bogar, Jonathan Brostrom, Israel Garcia, Jason Hovader, Matthew Phillips, Pruitt Rainey, and Gunners Willing. And I'm here today because of them. There were 40 other men. Other men came home because of their actions that day. We've gone on to have families, to get married, have kids, follow our dreams, all because of the sacrifice they made, and they represent the best of America. They represent, like so many others, all the men and women who have given their lives for this country. Is why it is the way it is. And I just would want to thank them for their sacrifice. And we get together and we talk about them all the time when I get together with my brothers. And I've never forgotten them. My kids are going to grow up knowing who they were, and what they did. It all comes down to love. Love for the men to our left and our right. And, the military is an amazing place where I think it represents the best of our country, that when we not even put aside our differences, but respect the things that make us unique and work together towards a common goal, that we can accomplish anything. And that's what we did that day. We came from all different backgrounds. I mean, Israel Garcia, his family, he was an immigrant. And he's just as American as anybody that was ever been born here. And he gave his life for me.
Military Order of the Purple Heart Service Foundation salutes Medal of Honor recipient Ryan Pitts and all who have sacrificed in service to our country.
The generation that served in Iraq witnessed the heaviest fighting since Vietnam. Time and time again, they proved that they had earned the right to be counted among America's greatest heroes. Yet with valor comes a price: lost lives, broken bodies. Incredible advances in battlefield medicine have saved the lives of many who in earlier eras might not have returned otherwise, but not all returned whole. We rightfully celebrate heroism on the battlefield, the men and women who risk all for their brothers and sisters in arms. There's also another kind of hero, the one who paid that price, who came home but not whole. Faith was tested, but somehow, some way, found light in the darkest of times.
United States Army Major Scott Smiley, known to his friends and family as Scotty, was born to serve. A star on his high school's state champion football team, Scotty followed his brother to West Point, graduating in 2003. Engraved on the inside of the new officer's class ring was his favorite Bible verse, "I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength." Spring 2005. Now Lieutenant Smiley was serving as a platoon leader in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. The previous 2 years had seen triumphs and challenges, from graduating Ranger School to losing comrades in combat. By that spring, a major al-Qaeda operative had come to the area, terrorizing the citizens and attacking the Americans with dozens of car bombs. It was up to Lieutenant Smiley's battalion to locate and shut down his operation. On March 17, 2005, during a break in patrols, Scott Smiley sat down to a video conference with his wife Tiffany, safe at home thousands of miles away. As always, he was struck by her beauty and grace. This would be the last time he would ever look upon her face. April 6. The daily battalion intelligence report read the same as most days. Terrorists had suicide car bombs and were willing to use them. Lieutenant Smiley's platoon was ordered to locate these vehicle IEDs before they could be used to kill more innocents. Mounted in the gun turret in the lead vehicle of the Stryker convoy, Lieutenant Smiley noticed a suspicious vehicle off to the right, driving slowly with its backside dragging on the ground, a telltale sign of a car bomb. Slowly, the Stryker approached the vehicle until Smiley was close enough to make eye contact. He ordered the driver to get out, but was met with silence as the car inched its way across the road. Lieutenant Smiley fired a warning shot at the ground in front of the car. The driver stopped, raised his hands from the wheel, and turned to look blankly into Smiley's eyes. The vehicle again inched forward, Smiley firing another warning shot. Suddenly, there was a bright flash, massive explosion, and Scotty Smiley's world went black. He awoke 2 weeks later in a hospital bed in Washington, D.C. The blast had sent shrapnel through his face, leaving him grievously wounded. Evacuated from the battlefield to Germany and eventually to Walter Reed Hospital, his life was saved only through the dedication and skill of Army surgeons. All the while, gathered at his side, friends and family prayed for his life and for God to let Scotty be Scotty. Though alive, Scotty quickly realized the terrifying reality. The blast had left him fully blind and paralyzed on one side. Fear soon turned to anger. Anger at the Army, at God, at himself. He was no longer a soldier or a leader, no longer Scotty. In time, he would regain the use of his limbs, but his blindness was permanent, and bitterness became part of his new reality. However, the love of his wife, family, and friends remained. Through his grueling rehab and adjustment to his new normal, their devotion began to soften his heart. 7 months after being wounded, while on a trip to Hawaii and in need of an escape, Scotty convinced a friend to take him surfing, a sport he'd never tried, even when he could see. To his surprise, he was a natural. Maybe the old athlete was still there. Maybe Scotty was still Scotty. Surfing turned into skydiving, and skydiving became mountain climbing. He even summited 14,000-foot Mount Rainier. Scotty Smiley began to realize that though his world was different, it was not impossible, that he could do all things through Christ, and that Scotty was still Scotty. In the days following his wounds, the Army began to process Scotty's medical retirement. But Scotty Smiley was born to serve and still had something to give. With the support of his wife and friends, Scotty would eventually return to active duty, the first blind officer in United States Army history. Scotty Smiley retired as a major in 2015. That same year, he completed the toughest competition in sports, the Ironman Triathlon. His story, like the stories of so many fellow wounded warriors, offers a constant reminder that through the darkest times, when all seems forsaken, there always remains a hope unseen.
I'm beyond honored to be here with the men and women who have served and given so much. This is awe-inspiring. This is amazing. I just hope that I have made a positive difference in one person's life every day, and it's still a goal I have today, is just to make a positive difference as I share my story with people around the world. Just no matter what troubles or trials that we've gone through, we have to stick together, and that we can make this world that much better of a place. And we have to stick together as a country and make and ensure that we're still the best country in the world. And I hope I've done my little part.
American Valor, a salute to our heroes, presented by Northrop Grumman, is sponsored in part by Yorktel Media Services.
"50 years ago, hundreds of thousands of young Americans answered their country's call to travel halfway around the world and fight for the freedom of the people of South Vietnam and Southeast Asia. They came from all corners of the country and all backgrounds. They served with an honor and valor that matched any generation of American soldiers throughout our history, even our greatest generation of World War II. Yet, when the war ended, they were not welcomed home. Their honorable service and their stories of valor were for decades largely ignored and left unsung. Among the unsung heroes of Vietnam was a young officer, Vincent OKAMOTO. Just as amazing as his military story was the story of how it all began decades earlier as a young boy during the Second World War. His story and his life are yet another example of what made the generation that served in Vietnam also great.
August 24th, 1968. Southwest Vietnam, near the Cambodian border. Men of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry, dubbed the Wolfhound Battalion, were on the lookout for enemy forces. Late in the day, they approached a small fire support base and were surprised to find it reinforced with armored personnel carriers and a tank. This meant one thing: enemy troops were in the area, and an attack was imminent. The men of B Company were ordered to quickly take positions in bunkers surrounding the base and wait. Just after 1 a.m., the sky erupted with an intense mortar barrage, followed by rocket-propelled grenades and machine gun fire. North Vietnamese Army forces concentrated their attack on a section of the base perimeter, disabling the tank and knocking out a bunker. The section's platoon leader had disappeared, and the surviving defenders were perilously low on ammunition. The position was in danger of being overrun. The situation desperate, the men found relief from a young second lieutenant from a nearby sector, Vincent OKAMOTO. Recognizing the danger, Lieutenant OKAMOTO rounded up 5 volunteers and crawled through the fire toward the attack. He immediately took charge, organizing defense and continually exposing himself to enemy fire not more than 30 feet away. Shortly after OKAMOTO arrived, the machine gunner manning a nearby armored personnel carrier was killed, leaving the men without supporting fire. Though his men pleaded with him not to go, that it meant certain death, Lieutenant OKAMOTO ran to the vehicle and manned its machine gun, raking the enemy position with return fire. When his gun was knocked out, he ran to another vehicle and then to a third, firing until he ran out of ammunition. During this final stand, he took a shot to the chest. The bullet only stopped by the M16 ammunition clip strapped across his chest. Though wounded, he would not be slowed, returning to the front and using hand grenades and his rifle to hold off the attack as his men watched in awe. Lieutenant OKAMOTO's actions bought valuable time for air support and reinforcements to arrive. The men serving alongside him were convinced that they would have been overrun if not for his valor. One man later wrote that while he had seen many acts of heroism during his year in Vietnam, none could match the valor of Vincent OKAMOTO. Vincent OKAMOTO's heroic story began 25 years earlier in the unlikeliest of circumstances. He was born November 22, 1943, in the Poston, Arizona War Relocation Center, an internment camp where American citizens of Japanese descent were being held during World War II. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, more than 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, including OKAMOTO's family, were forcibly placed in camps to be interned for most of the war. Though viewed as the enemy by many of their countrymen, many interned Japanese Americans relished the opportunity to prove their loyalty by serving during World War II. Vincent's two oldest brothers would join the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the all-Japanese American unit that would go on to become the most decorated unit in Army history. Another brother would volunteer for the Marines and serve in Korea. In the end, the OKAMOTO family would more than prove their loyalty and their bravery, with all 7 brothers serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. Vincent OKAMOTO would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his valor on August 24, 1968. Those who witness his actions believe he deserves nothing short of the Medal of Honor. He would also be awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts, making him the most highly decorated Japanese American to survive the war in Vietnam. Born into one of America's darkest moments, Vincent OKAMOTO could be justified in lamenting his country's failings. Instead, he embraced its ideals, going on to become one of its greatest battlefield heroes and eventually a Superior Court judge for Los Angeles County. All throughout, he inspired his countrymen with his courage, humility, and heart, a living example of American honor, and the kind of American we all hope to be.
There was that tradition of the 442nd, and they did. Many of them came out of the internment camps and volunteered to fight while their parents and their families were locked up behind barbed wire for 3 years. And that was a big part. They had to show that they were loyal Americans and that they were prepared to sacrifice to prove it, and they did. I think their critical lesson is that the people and the government of this nation collectively had better be prepared to support our troops when they go into combat, both during the war and when they return. That was not the case for many of the returning Vietnam veterans. They survived a year in Vietnam, they came back and met cold indifference or overt hostility. But they were magnificent soldiers, and they gave their all for this country. And what I think a lot of Vietnam veterans are proud of is that it took years, but the public, I think, accepted the fact that they treated the Vietnam veterans shabbily. And I think that transformed itself into today, when you go to the airport or you go to a bus terminal and you see a young man or woman in uniform, and someone comes up, shakes their hand and says, "Thank you for your service." I think if those words could have been heard by a lot of young Vietnam veterans, their lives would have been substantially changed. But we did our bit, that's past. We have young men and women now going off to war. So again, the government that sends them and the people that allow them to go had better be prepared to support them and respect them.
American Valor, a salute to our heroes, is presented by Northrop Grumman with support from Aon and the Coalition to Salute America's Heroes.
At dawn, Sunday, June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel, backed by artillery fire. Shortly thereafter, U.S. forces arrived to defend the South Korean allies. The Korean War had begun. The early weeks of the war proved disastrous for the Americans and their United Nations allies. They were vastly outnumbered, and the U.S. was ill-prepared for battle, having largely demobilized following the Second World War. UN forces were driven to the southern tip of South Korea and the brink of defeat. Yet, like their brothers in arms before and since, Facing a desperate situation, the Americans found the courage they did not know they possessed. Nearly surrounded, they held on at Pusan. They fought back, landed behind enemy lines at Incheon. They battled bitter cold and an overwhelming enemy at Chosin, and by their sacrifice ensured South Korea would have a chance at freedom. More than 36,000 Americans were killed in the Korean War. Another 92,000 were wounded. Each played a part in a story worth remembering, and each had their own story to tell. This is one of those stories.
Late night, August 11th, 1951. Near the border between North and South Korea, a patrol of American soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division prepare to move out on a mission to rescue the body of a fallen comrade captured and killed the night before. Assigned to lead the patrol was First Lieutenant Henry A. Schenck, a 29-year-old officer who had emigrated from Austria at the age of 6. Schenck had seen action in World War II, later serving as an interpreter at the Nuremberg trials. Among the dozen men from the company who volunteered for the mission was a young soldier from New Jersey, James McEACHIN. The two men knew little of each other. The Army had only recently been desegregated, and the white and black soldiers often kept to themselves. But Schenck seemed a good leader, a man who commanded respect. Schenck in turn entrusted the green soldier with serving as a point man on what they knew would be a dangerous mission. Briefed and ready to move out, the men advanced through the darkness. In an instant, the silence was broken by the crack of gunfire and the explosion of grenades, followed by the shouts and screams of wounded men. The patrol had been ambushed. Fire incoming from all directions, one by one the Americans fell. Shot through the thigh, McEACHIN returned fire, all the while watching in awe as Lieutenant Schenck directed their desperate defense. Shouting orders, Schenck stood tall, braving the enemy fire and drawing their attention to learn their position and cover his men's escape. Determined to assist his commander, the wounded McEACHIN desperately began crawling toward the lieutenant's position before taking a shot to the gut as two more men were felled by enemy fire. A sudden explosion rang out. McEACHIN watched as Lieutenant Schenck, fighting to save his men, fell to the ground. Seconds later, another blast hit near McEACHIN, and all went black. Some time later, McEACHIN awoke, lying face up in a nearby creek, the battlefield silent. The severity of his injuries quickly became apparent. He could barely move, the taste of gunpowder filling his mouth as he clutched his wounded abdomen. With what little strength he could muster, he began to crawl toward a patch of reeds. Suddenly, the shadow of a man began coming toward him, a blonde-haired American soldier in army fatigues. The soldier quickly began attending to McEACHIN's wounds, using his own t-shirt to craft a makeshift tourniquet. With McEACHIN half-conscious and unable to walk, without help, the soldier carried him across the countryside and through streams toward safety, all the while evading enemy troops. Reaching a forward aid station, McEACHIN was placed on a litter and prepped for evacuation. Through the fog, he would recall saying to his savior, "I never got your name." The soldier replied, "I never got yours either. Let's just say we're brothers under the skin." James McEACHIN was evacuated to Japan and eventually returned home to the States. He would go on to become a noted author, an actor, and in 1973, he became one of the first African Americans to star in a primetime television drama with NBC's Tenafly. He never learned the identity of the soldier who saved his life, the only other man to survive the patrol. The day following the ambush in Korea, a team was dispatched to search for survivors. None were found. The only item of interest was a single combat boot with a serial number etched inside, the boot belonging to First Lieutenant Henry A. Schenck, who gave his life fighting to save the lives of his men. For decades, Korea was known as the Forgotten War. Yet in recent years, veterans have begun calling it the forgotten victory, as their contribution has been more fully appreciated. 54 years after his action, bullet fragments still lodged in his ribs, James McEachin's contribution would also be more fully appreciated, as he was awarded the Silver Star to go with his Purple Heart. The valor he displayed on the battlefield and the honor displayed since proved common among the Korean War generation, the brothers under the skin, who, when called upon, were willing to sacrifice their lives for their country and each other.
I was in shock with how giving he was. I would invoke the name of God about 18 times. Thank God you were there when it happened. He was so brave, he was so courageous, he was so American. I would just have to say thank you, thank you, thank you. After it was over, I was carried back to the forward aid station, and then he said, I said to him, hey, I never got your name. And he said, I never got yours either. And he said, well, let's just, name's not important. Let's just say that we are brothers under the skin. So this blonde-haired boy, who I didn't know his name, or I couldn't describe him, he just said that, let's just say that we were brothers under the skin. And I've tried to live my life in that particular vein.
To take care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. Abraham Lincoln made this call to care for our military families near the end of our Civil War, 1 month before he died. And for more than 25 years, one family has lived it like no other. Zachary and Elizabeth Fisher began building homes in 1991 near military and VA hospitals across the country. These homes, known as Fisher houses, allowed families of service members and veterans to stay near their loved ones as they underwent treatment, all for no cost. Fisher House Foundation, now headed by Zachary Fisher's grandnephew, Ken Fisher, has become the gold standard for our military charities. A well-known veteran of Afghanistan can attest to the devotion of the Fisher family to our wounded. Prince Harry writes to us from London, "There has been no better friend nor greater champion for wounded veterans and their families than Ken Fisher and the Fisher family. Through his support of wounded, injured, and sick from both of our countries, he has played an invaluable role in rebuilding the lives of so many families in their time of need. Such kindness can only be repaid with respect and admiration." Another who appreciates the sacrifice of our military in a way very few can comprehend is our former Commander-in-Chief, President George W. Bush.
In 1991, my father, President George H.W. Bush, dedicated the first Fisher House at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. For more than 25 years, the Fisher House has worked to ensure that our military men and women and their families receive the first-rate treatment they deserve. The Fisher House program is a legacy of love created by Zachary and Elizabeth Fisher. Under Ken Fisher's outstanding leadership, the program has expanded to a network of 71 homes near military bases and VA hospitals. These homes allow families to stay close to a hospitalized service member or veteran while undergoing vital treatments, all at no cost to the family. The Fisher House program has served more than 277,000 families, saving them more than $320 million in out-of-pocket expenses. And Fisher House Foundation has become one of America's most respected and effective organizations. This year, Ken served as chairman of the organizing committee for the Invictus Games. Prince Harry and President George thought he did a marvelous job. Ken, thank you for your commitment to serving those who have served our country. I am proud to call you friend and grateful for your work.
When I go to sleep tonight, I know that 1,000 families, military and veterans families, will have a place to stay tonight at no charge while their loved one receives treatment. This is the work that we do, that we become so passionate about, because in the end, it's about love. It's about love of God. It's about love of country. It's about love of family. But most of all, it's about respect for those who wore and wear today our nation's uniform. It is an amazingly humbling experience for someone who did not wear this nation's uniform to be recognized by veterans. So I thank you very much.
Northrop Grumman is proud to support American Valor, a salute to our heroes in recognition of all who have served. American Valor, a salute to our heroes, is produced by the American Veterans Center, guarding the legacy and honoring the sacrifice of American heroes of every generation. To learn more, visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org.
While the Americans were rallying from Pearl Harbor and beginning their long push across the Pacific, another group of men were making a name for themselves in the Atlantic theater of World War II. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen are revered as one of the most famous units in all of military history. Yet, it wasn't always that way. Before proving themselves in the skies over Europe, they first had to prove to their countrymen that they belonged as pilots at all. They more than belonged. Through their dedication and skill, they not only gained acceptance from their peers, they became legends to all of us. And while most of their great heroes have since passed, few remain, a witness to a groundbreaking group of pilots and an extraordinary group of Americans.
July 2nd, 1943. American B-25 bombers approached their target along the coast of Sicily, preparing for the impending Allied invasion. As they open their bomb bays, two enemy FW-190s, elite German fighters, move in to attack the American bombers' easy targets and in their sights. Suddenly, a U.S. Army Air Force's P-40 speeds into position between the bombers and the German fighters. Maneuvering inside of the enemy fighters, the pilot unleashes a long burst of fire, watching tracers smash into his target. The German fighter lurches to the left, then drops from the sky, crashing into the ground below as his wingman flees for safety. Neither the German fighters nor the American bombers realized that history has just been made, as the pilot of the P-40 was Lieutenant Charles B. Hall of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, today better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, and the first African-American pilots in U.S. military history. This marked the first of more than 100 confirmed kills. Their story had begun just 2 years earlier, July 1941, when 13 recruits reported for training in Tuskegee, Alabama. As the gathering storm of the late 1930s erupted into all-out war in Europe, Americans of all backgrounds braced for the moment the war would come to them, with many eager to serve. Yet prejudice still held sway in official policy, and no black man had ever been allowed to serve as a pilot in the U.S. military. After much lobbying and the need for talented pilots in the event of war, promising African-American recruits were selected for the newly formed 99th in what many called the Tuskegee experience. Training would prove intense and follow the exact framework as that of the white recruits. The men welcomed the rigor. They knew that in order to be accepted, they'd have to be every bit as good as the white pilots, and then some. In March 1942, the first class of Tuskegee Airmen completed training and earned their wings. Among them was Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a graduate of West Point and son of the Army's first African-American general officer. Years later, Davis would join his father in making history, becoming the first African-American general in the Air Force. Now, Captain Davis was to take command of the Tuskegee Airmen as they prepared for deployment and for battle. At this moment of opportunity, it would be up to Davis and his growing band of airmen to prove that they were worthy pilots and that talent would overcome prejudice. The 99th was ordered to North Africa, flying missions in the invasions of Sicily and Italy. They joined 3 new squadrons, forming the 332nd Fighter Group, earning the nickname Red Tails for the bright red paint on the fins of their fighters. The Red Tails were soon transferred to Italy, flying missions over mainland Europe. There they were joined by a young second lieutenant, fresh out of flight school. Charles McGee was born in Cleveland, the son of a minister. Joining the University of Illinois ROTC program in 1939, he leapt at the opportunity to train as a pilot. By the time Lieutenant McGee began flying combat missions in February 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen were earning a reputation as excellent combat pilots. In fact, they were in high demand among the white bomber crews they escorted into battle, aware of the Red Tails' record of protecting the B-17s and B-24s. On August 23rd, as Lieutenant McGee piloted his P-51C, nicknamed Kitten, on a bombing mission over Czechoslovakia, a German FW-190 streaked through the American bomber formation. Over the radio, McGee was given the order, "Go get him." On cue, Lieutenant McGee broke from the formation and fell in behind the fighter. The enemy pilot was skilled, taking evasion action and diving for the ground before racing over a German airfield. All the while, McGee was locked on his target. The enemy fighter in his sights, McGee fired a burst, raking the plane with bullets before it crashed into the ground. His first confirmed victory. He continued low to the ground to avoid anti-aircraft fire, then rejoined his comrades in the sky. Charles McGee had flown a total of 136 combat missions by the time he was transferred home to serve as an instructor on November 23, 1944. He would remain in the Air Force for 30 years, flying combat missions in Korea and Vietnam, and retiring a colonel. His 3-war total of 409 combat missions is the Air Force record that still survives today. A legend among a legendary group of men, Charles McGee would survive to be one of the last remaining great pilots of the Tuskegee Airmen. One of the last links to a band of trailblazers who, 75 years ago, proved to their country and to themselves that they had earned their place in the pantheon of America's greatest heroes.
Well, I think to realize that we're Americans who happen to be black, once given an opportunity, performed in a way that disproved the generalizations, in some cases even racist thoughts that because of color of skin, we had no capability and could not work well with a white person, and that we could do, physically well qualified to cook food, dig ditches, drill roads, but not able to do mentally or morally anything technical like maintain or fly an aircraft. So that policy became a part of the Air Force mobilization program when America got involved in World War II. And so we were really denied participation in aviation. At the time, we were just Americans glad to be able to take part in what was taking place because country, having come out of 10 years of depression, we were just as eager to take the jobs in the military build-up and to enter into the service where they're drafted or otherwise. And so it was a circumstance at the time, although there was segregation, America still came behind the effort that we would defeat Hitler and then later the Japanese.
American Airlines salutes Colonel Charles McGee and the legendary Tuskegee Airmen on their 75th anniversary. American Valor, A Salute to Our Heroes is produced by the American Veterans Center, guarding the legacy and honoring the sacrifice of American heroes of every generation. To learn more, visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org.
The United States in World War II, it began 75 years ago, December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor. The attack would leave America reeling, yet it would rally the nation like no event in our history. After an early string of defeats, the U.S. military would strike back in April 1942 with Jimmy Doolittle's raid on Tokyo. The stunning victory at Midway put the Americans on the offensive in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. From island to island, U.S. forces slowly advanced toward the heart of the empire and ultimate victory. Meanwhile, in Europe, green American troops in North Africa became battle-tested warriors in Sicily and Italy, on the beaches of Normandy and over the skies of Germany. Generals like Eisenhower and Patton became more than just household names. They became legends. 16 million Americans served in the military during World War II. More than 400,000 died. It was the defining event of the 20th century and one of the defining moments in all of history. And for the United States, it began on a quiet Sunday morning, deep in the Pacific, with a gallant stand by a small band of heroes.
By December 1941, the world was at war. Europe was reeling from the Nazis' blitz. In the West, a determined Britain stood alone. Meanwhile, imperial Japanese armies marched through China. Great nations and civilized peoples were enveloped by a new, terrible sort of war. To the young sailors, soldiers, and Marines stationed at the U.S. Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, it all seemed a million miles away. Despite rising tensions with Japan, the small Hawaiian outpost remained a peaceful paradise. The first Saturday of the month, freshly paid sailors with cash to spend hit the shore for a night on the town. Some were just rolling in as the sun rose the next morning, Sunday, December 7th. Aboard the USS Nevada, the band played Morning Colors as the Stars and Stripes was raised, and a giant wave of planes appeared off in the distance. It was 7:48 a.m. Moments later, chaos ensued, and the world would be forever changed. Japanese dive bombers and fighters rained fire upon American fighters, easy targets parked wingtip to wingtip on the ground. But the real target was the pride of the U.S. Navy, the battleships moored just off Ford Island. All along Battleship Row, sleeping sailors awoke to the explosion of bombs and the sounds of alarms calling them to battle stations. At headquarters, a desperate message was sent to all ships in the area. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Immediately, the USS Oklahoma was hit by 3 torpedoes and began to capsize. The California was hit by 2 bombs and torpedoes, while the captain of the USS West Virginia was mortally wounded by a bomb that hit the nearby Tennessee. At 8:06 a.m., a bomb crashed through the forward deck of the USS Arizona, setting off more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder and igniting a massive fireball. Nearly 1,200 men aboard the Arizona would be killed in the blast. Yet amid the shock and destruction, the Americans rallied and heroes began to emerge. Aboard the shattered Arizona, its senior surviving officer, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, ankle deep in water and cigar stub in his mouth, ignored enemy gunfire and calmly evacuated his burned and maimed men from the sinking ship. Only when it was nearly abandoned did he and 2 fellow officers commandeer a boat and make their way toward shore. He would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. Aboard the West Virginia, a young cook and laundry attendant named Dory Miller leapt into action, carrying his mortally wounded captain to safety. Though he had no training, he took charge of a .50 caliber machine gun and blasted the attacking planes, actions for which he would receive the Navy Cross. Army pilots George Welch and Kenneth Taylor were two of the boys who'd spent the previous night out on the town, attending a formal dance before playing poker until the sun came up. Jerking awake to the sound of explosions and ready to join the fight, they suited back up in their tuxedo pants and leapt into Taylor's Buick, dodging bullets on the way to their airfield. They took off in their P-40 fighters, the first American pilots to get airborne that day, eventually shooting down at least 6 enemy fighters. 2 waves of attacks over 90 minutes had left Pearl Harbor smoldering. Battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and California had been sunk, while the Nevada was beached trying to escape to open water. A dozen other ships were damaged and nearly 200 airplanes were destroyed. Almost 2,500 people were killed, with more than 1,000 wounded. Yet, the destruction was not total. Despite complete surprise, the defenders of Pearl Harbor had fought with such tenacity that the Japanese command decided against launching a third wave, attacks that would have targeted Pearl Harbor's fuel, maintenance, and dry dock facilities. Their survival would enable the fleet to recover far more quickly, which would have a major impact 6 months later at the epic Battle of Midway and the turning of the tide in the Pacific War. The attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into World War II. Its inspired defense rallied the nation to fight on. At Normandy, where the USS Nevada rejoined the fight, battering German defenses along the shore. At the Philippines, where the USS California, raised from the bottom of Pearl Harbor, helped clear the way for General MacArthur's return. And in Tokyo Bay, where the raised West Virginia arrived for the final surrender ceremonies nearly 4 years after that day of infamy, the culminating moment for the generation who would become known as America's greatest.
First of all, we need to give a lot of credit to some of our brilliant military leaders. Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Halsey, General MacArthur, General Patton, and it so happens I had the distinct pleasure of shaking hands with Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey. But you need to understand, this conflict was not won by the military alone. All of our families left at home sacrificed many things to enable our industry to build hardware for our military. I've been told that my generation was the greatest generation of all, and I agree. However, this great nation still has the potential to return to that level.
Northrop Grumman honors the defenders of Pearl Harbor and all who have served in the Second World War. We will never forget your service and sacrifice.
Throughout American history, it is in our darkest moments that heroes rise. Amid the devastation of Pearl Harbor and defeat after defeat in the early days of World War II, a band of pilots took to the skies in an impossible mission to change the momentum of the war. The mission was to fly unescorted Army bombers into enemy territory and hit the heart of the Japanese Empire. The pilots and their crews knew it could well be a one-way trip. They went anyway. In the end, their mission proved more than a success. It rallied the nation in ways none thought possible. The darkness of Pearl Harbor was past. Now there was hope. 60 years later, America would see its darkest day since Pearl Harbor. On that day, new heroes would rise. New pilots would take to the skies for another impossible mission, armed only with the same courage inspired by generations before. A courage inspired by a now legendary story. A band of 80 men aboard 16 bombers and a mission that changed history.
There are moments, and there are men, that galvanize a nation and change history. The weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor were met with disaster for the United States and the Pacific theater of World War II. Ships were sunk, planes were lost, and troops were forced to surrender. Morale among the military and Americans at home was astoundingly low. Just before Christmas, 1941, President Roosevelt told the Joint Chiefs to find a way to strike back at Japan as soon as possible, to prove to the Imperial Japanese and to Americans that they were not invincible. The mission would not be easy. Some thought it impossible. The American fleet was reeling, and Japan's defenses were strong. U.S. Army bombers would need to be specially outfitted not only to launch from aircraft carriers, but to have sufficient range to fly over Japan and on to safety in China. Only one man could be trusted to plan such a mission: the military's best engineer, the famous test pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. On April 18, 1942, Doolittle and his co-pilot, Richard E. Cole, led 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet toward Japan. Each of the 80 men who flew with Doolittle knew that this could be a suicide mission. Not only did they face Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, after being spotted, they were forced to launch their planes 200 miles early. Even if they made it to Japan, there was now no guarantee they would have enough fuel to reach safety in China. All 16 bombers reached Japan, hitting military targets in Tokyo and several other cities. Short on fuel, each of the crews were forced to bail out or crash land their planes. One landed in Russia, where its crew was interned. 3 men died evacuating their planes. 8 were captured by the Japanese and held prisoner. 3 were executed, and 1 died in captivity. The rest of the raiders regrouped and made their way to safety. Doolittle himself thought the raid a failure. Having caused minimal damage and losing all of his planes, he expected to be court-martialed. Little did Doolittle and his men know that the raid had caused a sensation back home. Morale shot through the roof as the American public, reeling from defeat after defeat, watched as the U.S. military had struck at the heart of the Japanese Empire. Just as important, the Japanese military, shocked by the attack, reorganized its defenses, diverting material to defend the home islands. This would have tremendous impact 2 months later, as the entire tide of the war would shift in the Americans' favor following the epic Battle of Midway. Jimmy Doolittle would receive the Medal of Honor for leading the raid on Tokyo. Each of the 79 other raiders were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders would go down in history among the most legendary veterans of the Second World War. 80 men took part in the Doolittle raid. 62 would survive World War II. As the years passed, so did the Doolittle Raiders, with Doolittle himself passing away in 1993. Nearly 75 years after the raid, only one survives: Doolittle's co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Cole, the last witness to an impossible mission that changed the course of a war and defined a generation.
I am humbled to have participated in that important mission. Heading out, none of us knew exactly what we were in for. When we learned the details of our mission, we were given a chance to back out. Nobody did. And I know that every generation since would have done the same thing.
There are no normal days for Army Rangers in a combat zone, and the morning of April 18, 2010 proved no exception. In a small village in eastern Afghanistan, a team of Army Rangers was locked in combat with insurgents armed with machine guns firing into their position. When a Ranger was hit, one of his comrades, 28-year-old Sergeant First Class Joe Kapacheski, sprinted through the fire to provide aid. With the help of a fellow Ranger, they dragged the wounded soldier to safety, actions which would earn Kapacheski, nicknamed Cap, the Army Commendation Medal with Valor. Cap's actions would be extraordinary under any circumstances, but considering where he was just a few years earlier, they were nearly unthinkable. A native of Connecticut, Joe enlisted in the Army following his senior year of high school in September 2001, just days before the September 11th attacks. In 2002, he was deployed to Afghanistan with the Elite Rangers, and the following year parachuted into Iraq in the initial invasion. With only 2 days left in his 5th deployment to Iraq in 2005, Cap's life would change forever. His convoy was ambushed by heavy fire. A grenade fell through the hatch of his Stryker vehicle, exploding inches from Cap's right side. Shrapnel tore through his body, shattering his right leg and severing an artery in his right arm, and wounding 2 fellow Rangers. Severely wounded, Cap gathered himself and directed his vehicle to cover and alerted the rest of the convoy to the attack. Only then would he allow his wounds to be treated. Cap was evacuated to Walter Reed Hospital, where doctors feared nerve damage had cost him the use of his arm. But in time, wiggling a finger led to making a fist, and gradually his strength returned, helped in large part by his wife Kimberly, who wheeled him to the hospital's mock shooting range to fire a laser-equipped rifle. But while his arm recovered, his leg did not. Despite countless surgeries, external rods, and 18 pins holding it together, his leg was still barely functional and in severe chronic pain. His dream of returning to his squad to lead Rangers in action looked to be over. In time, he was left with one decision: to amputate his leg below the knee. The pain now gone, Cap went immediately to rehab, was fit with a prosthetic, and began working out with one goal in mind: returning to combat duty. Most, including his fellow Rangers, thought it impossible. No one in his condition had ever returned to combat, and no exceptions would be made to the exacting physical standards required by the Rangers. They said he had done his duty, that it was over. But it wasn't over. Walking became running, and running became sprinting. He passed the road march test, ran 5 miles under 40 minutes, parachuted with a combat load, and earned his way back into the action. He regained his squad leader position and was promoted to platoon sergeant, and in 2009 became the first Ranger in U.S. Army history to return to combat action with a prosthetic limb. Sergeant First Class Joe Kapacheski has been awarded the Bronze Star with Valor and Purple Heart, among many other decorations, and has been deployed to combat 10 times, 5 with an artificial limb. And while his goal was always to be a Ranger, not a war hero, an amputee, his uniquely American comeback story is a living example of the honor and resiliency of the American soldier.
American Valor, a salute to our heroes, presented by Northrop Grumman, is sponsored in part by Military Order of the Purple Heart Service Foundation and Veterans United Home Loans.
What is the measure of a man? I think it's what he makes of each day and how he deals with adversity, no matter the odds. September 2007. Warned by intelligence that a top al-Qaeda terrorist had been operating out of a neighborhood in Fallujah, Iraq, U.S. Navy SEALs silently approached the targeted compound in the dimness of the early evening. Commanding the mission was SEAL Officer Lieutenant Jason Redman. As they searched the compound, several armed men ran from a nearby building towards a thicket. The SEALs quickly realized they had the wrong target. Pursuing the insurgents, they were met with heavy fire from what turned out to be highly trained al-Qaeda fighters. Redman and his men were caught in an open field, their night vision goggles nearly useless against the hidden enemy. Bullets smacked the ground as Redman watched a teammate go down, his leg shattered. Leading a desperate defense, Redman himself soon fell, a bullet ripping through his arm. Knowing he couldn't be reached without others being exposed, he struggled to his feet and began to fall back. He made it just a few steps before he felt an incredible smash to his face. He slumped to the ground, lifeless. Lieutenant Redman woke to flares of red light cutting through the darkness. Air support, arriving as the battle intensified. He had lost so much blood that he had to will himself to breathe. Flat on his back, he came to the terrifying realization that he had been shot in the face. Then and there, he accepted his fate, that he would die on the battlefield. As he began to let go, a single thought rushed into his mind. His wife, his family. Miraculously, with what strength remained, and with the aid of a teammate, he rose to his feet and struggled to a nearby medevac, collapsing into the darkness. As he slowly gained consciousness through a drug-induced fog, Redman found himself in a hospital, his face shattered and his arm nearly torn off. He faced months of surgeries, metal plates, skin and bone grafts, and rehab. He found comfort in the fact that his wife Erica was determined to stand by him no matter what. But what was truly difficult was the sorrow and pity he knew others felt for him. But that was not going to keep him down. Determined to do something about it, with a poster board and a marker, he penned a warning to those entering his room and posted it on his door. To all who enter here, if you are coming into this room with sorrow or to feel sorry for my wounds, go elsewhere. The wounds I received, I got in a job I love, supporting the freedom of a country I deeply love. I am incredibly tough and will make a full recovery. What is full? That is the absolute utmost physically my body has to recover. Then I will push that 20% further through sheer mental tenacity. This room you are about to enter is a room of fun, optimism, and intense, rapid regrowth. Signed, the management. Photos of the signs soon made their way online. The story of Lieutenant J, U.S. Navy SEAL, a wounded warrior who refused to surrender to his wounds, went viral. His sign became the motto for thousands of fellow wounded warriors to come. Though the body may be broken, the spirit remains unconquerable.
Uncommon valor. Among Marines, time and time again, in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, this has proven to be a common virtue. This virtue was tested on the battlefields of Iraq and again in the mountains of Afghanistan, no more so than in the Kunar province near the Pakistani border, September 8, 2009. Early that morning, American advisors were to join Afghan troops for a pre-dawn meeting with elders of a small mountain village. The group was then ambushed by more than 50 insurgents, heavily armed and firing from houses and fortified positions on the slopes above. In the attack, 4 Americans were cut off and taking heavy fire. Maintaining security at a nearby rally point was 21-year-old Marine Corps Corporal Dakota Meyer. Hearing over his radio that the Americans were pinned down, Meyer took action. With a fellow Marine driving, Meyer manned the gunner's position as they made their way toward the fighting in an attempt to help. Approaching the fight, the Marines drew intense fire. Though his position was exposed, Meyer refused to take cover. He continued to fire the mounted machine gun and his rifle. Twice venturing into the ambush, the 2 Marines evacuated 24 Afghan soldiers, many of them wounded. Grabbing a new vehicle when the mounted gun was knocked out, he returned to the action a 3rd time to provide cover for the remaining soldiers. Despite taking shrapnel to the arm, he returned again, evacuating wounded Afghans and continuing the search for the missing Americans. Finally, on his 5th trip into the kill zone hours into the battle, Meyer dismounted the vehicle and moved in on foot, locating and retrieving the bodies of his 4 fallen comrades. Meyer's bold initiative not only disrupted the insurgents' attacks, it inspired fellow American and Afghan troops to continue the fight. On this day, Dakota Meyer reaffirmed that uncommon valor was still a common virtue among Marines. Not since the Vietnam War had a Marine stood in the White House and received the Medal of Honor. That would change September 15, 2011, as President Obama awarded Sergeant Dakota Meyer our military's highest award, the first living Marine in 38 years to be so honored. The Medal of Honor has always held a special place of reverence within the American military, no more than the present generation. Those who have received it, starting posthumously with Paul Smith in Iraq and Michael Murphy in Afghanistan, are symbols of valor, honor, and sacrifice of the millions who served in these 2 wars. Dakota Meyer's actions, and those of thousands of his fellow Marines, validate that the proud traditions of the United States Marine Corps continue to live on.
The audacity to do the impossible. There are some moments and some men in the history of our country who have accomplished feats so extraordinary, the mere mention of their names instantly reminds us of the uniquely American spirit. July 16, 1969. As millions watch on television around the world, 3 American astronauts aboard a small craft atop a Saturn V rocket blast off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida in an attempt to accomplish the impossible, to set foot on the moon. The audacious mission, known as Apollo 11, would have been unthinkable prior to a speech delivered to Congress by President Kennedy 8 years earlier. In that speech, he envisioned land a man on the moon and returning him safely before the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Tapped to lead this impossible mission were astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. Clear of Earth's atmosphere, the men of Apollo 11 headed toward orbit of the moon. On July 20th, with Aldrin and Armstrong aboard the lunar module nicknamed the Eagle, separated from the command module and began its descent toward the lunar surface. Absolute precision in every step of the landing was imperative. A single mistake could doom the mission and potentially leave the men stranded. At 4:17 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and with only 25 seconds of fuel remaining, the lunar module touched down on the Sea of Tranquility on the surface of the moon. Armstrong radioing home, Aldrin, capturing the solemnity of the moment, radioed home,
I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever, wherever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours and to give thanks in his or her own way.
As millions watched, Armstrong emerged from the lunar module in one of history's legendary moments. Shortly thereafter, Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface of the moon, awed by its beauty and describing it as magnificent desolation. The three men who had made President Kennedy's vision a reality, an impossible mission, made possible through the ingenuity, determination, and audacity of the same spirit that had been ingrained in Americans from generation to generation. And though that same spirit has been displayed countless times by countless Americans, it has never been so evident as on that day in July 1969, when a group of now legendary Americans took to the skies and conquered the unknown.